So a couple days ago, G2 Goes and came out with a bit of a strange comp on Corrode. It was this. It was Brim, Yoru, Vice, Waylay, Fade. Now the rest of this, these four, you might say, completely normal. Nothing unusual about that. But solo Brim smokes on a map like Corrode makes me go, what on earth is going on? And then Petra, after the game, said this.
Congratulations, Petra. Now, I think on Corrode is where your teamwork and experience really shine through, especially with Nova putting up a fight. I just wanted to ask you guys why you picked Brimstone for that comp. You know, why did you guys decide to kind of fit him into your winning methods?
So with Brim you obviously have like more smokes and faster. With Omen you have a long regen, and Flash kind of sucks now, so I think it feels really good, and the molly can delay so much, and yeah, Vanya is the best Brim there is, so why not?
Now, there was one part to that I do disagree with, of course, and that's the Omen Flash not being good anymore. I still think the Omen Flash is pretty good, because guess what? Having a Flash that you cannot turn and cannot shoot at the pro level is pretty strong still, considering it's the only Flash in the game that is true for. And in fact, there was an example from that very game that they played, that Petra's giving that interview for. In that game, you see here that a paranoia is going to go out, and it means that Akita is completely isolated on the site, because both Petra and Mimi get hit by the Omen paranoia, which basically gives Nova a free kill. Now, that is a round that they did technically manage to win after the fact, so, you know, fair play, but I don't need to show you a ton of examples of the Omen paranoia being good. Hopefully you know that there are many examples of Omen paranoia being good that I could show you that exist, because having a Flash that you cannot turn and cannot shoot is going to give you a higher value floor than pretty much any other Flash in the game, and that's what the Omen paranoia does. But the other parts of it, that is where I think it gets quite interesting. This is actually something I was thinking about even before G2 played this, because Lothar, I think, made a tier list that had Brim pretty high, and it did get me thinking about, now that the Omen recharge is 40 seconds, how often are you actually getting that refresh? How often is that actually happening for you to where you end up with 4 or more smokes in a round? Now, for those of you wondering, and I am just going to show you a quick clip of me, you know, proving this in game. Omen, of course, now has a 40-second cooldown on his smokes, which means to get to 4 smokes in the round, of course, needs to last 80 seconds at least, and that is assuming that, you know, you put out a smoke, you know, at the very start of the round. Now, to be fair, oftentimes you will put a smoke out, perhaps, at the very start of the round, so that's not too unusual for that to be the case, but the round does need to last a pretty significant length of time for you to able to get to 4 smokes. Now, you can actually, in theory, get 5 smokes as well, and this will happen, you know, rarely, but it can happen, which again is if you use smokes kind of early on and the round kind of goes as long as it possibly can, and hopefully I'm showing this to you now as well, and then a post plant goes on for a bit of time, you can end up with 5 smokes in a round. So in theory, Omen can get 5 smokes in a round, but I wanted to test how often does that actually happen. How often do you even get 4 smokes in a round, you know, or the ability to use 4 smokes in a round? Because obviously when you're comparing someone like Brim to Omen, one of the main things that you're going to say, or certainly that we used to say, right, is that Omen has more smokes, right? Like, so why would you pick Brim? Because you're going to get extra smokes. Well, with the new changes, how often is that actually happening? And so what I did, and I don't have a grand sample size here, but I took a look at the game NRG versus G2 at Red Bull Homeground. So this is on the new patch. We're on Corrode, which is the map that G2 are also using Brimstone on. And I went through the entire game, which was a 23-round game. Both teams here, both NRG and G2, are both playing Omen. And I wanted to see how often did Kiko and Valen get the chance to actually, you know, potentially use 4 smokes. And honestly, it wasn't that much. It was only 7 out of 46 times. Now, I'm going to just play you around here, round number 11, where this actually happens for, you know, both teams. So both NRG and G2, both Kiko and Valen, get the chance to use 4 smokes. I didn't necessarily require them to have used their 4 smoke for this, just that they had the option to do it if they wanted to, right? So if at any point in a round they got the chance to use a 4th smoke, then I counted that. But out of 46 times that it was potential, right? 23 for Valen, 23 for Kiko. They only did it 7 times. It was 4 for Kiko and 3 for Valen, and almost all of those, 6 out of 7 times, happened on G2's attack side. Now, you might think that that does make some sense, right? G2 generally play a bit slower than NRG. G2 are, I would say, you know, a slower than average team overall as well. So you might think, yeah, that makes sense that most of them are going to happen on G2's side. But I think that does illustrate something as well, that maybe for someone like G2, who are going to play a bit slower, or someone like Fnatic, of course, you know, you might say, well, for them, it is worth playing it because their attack sides are going to be pretty slow. But you can see that the kind of round that we're playing out here is one where, you know, G2 go towards A, they then decide to completely flip the map. The spike goes down at 31 seconds, and, you know, NRG are still have a lot of space to clear, therefore this is going to take some time as well. And that's how we end up in this situation where both Kiko and Valorant get the chance to use their 4th smoke in the round. But obviously these rounds don't happen all the time, right? And they didn't happen that often in this game. There was only 2 rounds where both of them, you know, had that opportunity to do so. Of course, sometimes your controller will die early on, you know, so those rounds you don't get the chance. And then a lot of rounds, of course, the round is just over before those cooldowns ever come online. And so I do think it is quite interesting that if only 7 out of 46, and particularly if you're a team like NRG who's going to play, you know, fairly fast, you're not going to get maybe that opportunity of having a ton of smokes, right? If you're a fairly fast team, if you're Paper X or someone, you know, that Omen cooldown, you might as well just see it as we're only going to get 3 smokes, you know, maybe 4 every once in a while, and never 5. Because even in a game between G2 and NRG, even then it was pretty rare for it to happen, and they aren't necessarily the fastest teams in the world. Now, the other thing that you might consider, though, when picking a Brimstone over an Omen, and one of the other limitations that Brim has generally had, is, of course, his smoke range. Now, here again are some clips of you just kind of showing the general smoke range for an agent like Brim on Corrode, and it was actually better than I thought, to be honest. You know, the Brim, it was worse back in the past, you know, but they did buff his range, you know, a while ago now. But, you know, it's not completely unplayable like you might think it is, but you definitely will be limited, right? And again, if you do want to use that Brim Molly, you know, to help you kind of hold down a site, and that, you know, you want your controller to be a site anchor, of course, that means that if they do go completely to the other side of the map and you're sat, you know, in the middle of A, yeah, you're not going to be able to help your teammate on B. And so that definitely will come into consideration, you know, some of the time for sure, that the, you know, range restriction is going to restrict you. But, you know, right now, for instance, you know, and playing Viper is very popular. You could, like, you know, many teams do on Bind all the time, just combine Brim with a Viper if you wanted to as well, or some other smokes potentially even if you wanted to also, and kind of overcome that range restriction. But for, you know, potential smaller maps, you know, I'm thinking of something like maybe Sunset or something like that, you know, where maybe the map is just overall smaller, therefore it's easier to, you know, have that range potentially for you. Maybe it's not as big of an issue on maps like that. And the thing is, recently as well, I think we've seen a bit of a spike in agents like Killjoy, a bit of a spike, you know, of course, again, for an agent like Viper. And Brim, I think, and you could add Astra into this as well, right, in terms of competing for Omen's role that, you know, we've talked about him dominating so much. What those kind of agents allow you to do, particularly if other agents like Viper, like Killjoy are coming into the game, is play some cringe post-plant stuff. Right, like if you've got a comp that has Killjoy, Sova, Astra, you know, Viper, you can, if you get the spike down, you can do a lot of cringe stuff. You can build a comp to make that a post plant option for you. Not that you should necessarily play that as every post plant, but on certain ones, you know, if you've got Brim with a Molly and an ult, you know, and you've got Killjoy, and you've got Viper, and you've got whatever else, right, that you can put on the spike, that could be an option. So, has Brim now become a viable option on a lot of maps? Well, I still think if you're going to play solo Brim in particular, that certain maps probably are still going to be too big and a bit, you know, you are still going to feel a bit limited at times, where people might be able to exploit that. However, I do think that if you're pairing it, you know, with another controller, and or you are on a smaller map and you want to play a very aggressive style, you know, faster style, then you could argue that, yeah, Brim smokes last longer, and I can put all 3 down at once if I ever need to. And potentially I have very good post-plant stall if that's an area where you're struggling. Now, I personally think that Omen's overall versatility, right, the entirety of the Omen kit is still good enough to warrant, you know, not doing that. But is it an option if you want to go in for a very specific playstyle? I think with these smoke nerfs, definitely more than it used to be.